The filthy truth about medieval marriage. Medieval marriage is often imagined as a gentle union blessed by love, faith, and family. In reality, it was a hard transactional institution shaped by survival, property, and power. Romance, when it existed at all, was a luxury few could afford. For most people in medieval Europe, marriage was less about personal happiness and more about economics, social order, and control over women's bodies and labor. To begin with, love was rarely the reason people married. Among peasants, marriage was a practical partnership. Two people combining labor to survive. A wife brought her ability to work fields, care for animals, spin wool, brew ale, and bear children. A husband brought land access, protection, and a name. Among nobles, marriage was even colder. It was a political contract used to secure alliances, end feuds, expand territory, or consolidate wealth. Children, sometimes as young as 7 or 8, were betrothed long before they understood what marriage meant. Consent existed on paper, but in practice, it was meaningless. Age gaps were common and disturbing. Girls could legally marry at 12, boys at 14. In noble families, a teenage girl might be married to a man twice or 3 times her age. Childbearing was expected immediately, despite the severe risks. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women, and many did not survive their first pregnancy. A woman's value in marriage was closely tied to her fertility. Failure to produce heirs could lead to neglect, humiliation, or replacement. Dowries ruled everything. A woman's family paid a dowry to the groom, meant to support the household or secure the husband's commitment. If the dowry was small, the wife's status suffered. If it was large, she might be tolerated, even if unloved. Disputes over dowries were common and brutal. A woman abandoned or mistreated often had no legal way to reclaim her dowry. Marriage locked wealth into male-controlled hands. Once married, a woman's legal identity largely disappeared. Under the principle of coverture, a wife was legally absorbed into a husband. She could not own property independently, sign contracts, or bring lawsuits in her own name in many regions. Her body, labor, and obedience were considered marital obligations. The church taught that a wife must submit to her husband as part of God's order. Disobedience was framed as sin. Marital violence was widespread and normalized. While the church occasionally condemned excessive brutality, it also taught that a husband had the right to correct his wife. This euphemism often meant physical punishment. Courts rarely intervened unless the violence was extreme or publicly scandalous. For peasant women especially, suffering in silence was the norm. Divorce was almost impossible. At best, couples could seek separation without the right to remarry, an economic death sentence for most women. Sex within marriage was not private or affectionate in the modern sense. It was regulated, moralized, and often joyless. The church dictated when sex was allowed, banning it on Sundays, holy days, during Lent, Advent, menstruation, pregnancy, and after childbirth. This left surprisingly few approved days. Sex was meant for procreation, not pleasure. Female desire was treated with suspicion, even fear. Manuals warned that lustful women were gateways for sin and chaos. Infidelity, however, followed double standards. Men's affairs were often tolerated, especially among nobles, where mistresses were common and sometimes openly acknowledged. Women, on the other hand, faced devastating consequences. Adultery could lead to public shaming, mutilation, imprisonment, or death. A woman's sexuality was seen as family property. Violating it was a crime against male honor. Even weddings themselves were far from fairy tales. Peasant weddings were loud, crude, and exhausting. Days of drinking, ribald jokes, and communal celebration that often ended in public rituals mocking the couple. Bedding ceremonies, where witnesses escorted the couple to bed, were not uncommon, especially among nobles, to ensure the marriage was consummated. Privacy was rare. The community felt entitled to oversee the union. Love did exist, but usually outside marriage, not within it. Courtly love poems celebrated longing, secrecy, and forbidden desire. Precisely because marriage offered none of these. Emotional intimacy was risky. Life expectancy was short, work was relentless, and grief was constant. Many couples learned to cooperate rather than connect. In the end, medieval marriage was less a bond between equals and more a system designed to control inheritance, reproduction, and labor. It preserved social hierarchies and reinforced male authority at every level. For women, it was often a life sentence of pregnancy, work, obedience, and silence. For men, it was duty, pressure, and responsibility rather than romance. The filthy truth is this: medieval marriage was not broken by modern standards. It was built that way. It was never meant to make people happy. It was meant to make society function, no matter the human cost. Close your eyes now and let the heaviness of your own day dissolve into the twilight of another time. Imagine the sensation of cool, rough stone beneath your fingertips, damp with the evening mist that clings to the rolling hills of 12th century Europe. There is a smell here, thick and earthy, wood smoke mixed with the damp decay of fallen leaves, and the faint, sweet scent of dried lavender, tucked into a bodice to mask the scent of a long week without a bath. The light is fading, turning the sky a bruised purple, and the only sound is the rhythmic, distant lowing of cattle settling in for the night, a sound that has not changed in 1,000 years. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. Now, let us step through the veil. We are moving away from the polished glass of modern expectations and peering through the cracks of a wooden shutter. The history books often paint this era with broad golden strokes, knights in shining armor, ladies in tall conical hats, waving handkerchiefs, and weddings that are nothing but feasts and flowers. But the camera of our mind must adjust to the lower light. We are looking for the texture of reality, the grit under the fingernails of the past. The myth of the medieval marriage is a velvet curtain, heavy and embroidered with tales of courtly love and chivalry. But tonight, we gently pull that curtain back to reveal the scaffolding behind it. It is darker here, quieter, and infinitely more human. We begin by understanding that the concept of us, you and me against the world, falling in love and building a life, was a luxury as rare as sugar or silk. For the vast majority of souls drifting through these centuries, from the muddy hamlets of England to the sun-baked vineyards of France, marriage was not a chapter in a romance novel. It was a merger. Imagine standing in a small thatched cottage. The floor is packed earth, covered in rushes, dried reeds that crunch softly underfoot, and harbor a distinct ecosystem of beetles and memories. In the center, a fire pit smolders, the smoke drifting lazily toward a hole in the roof stinging your eyes just a little. Here, a young man and a young woman are not gazing into each other's eyes with starry wonder. They are looking at the family cow. It sounds unromantic, perhaps even a bit funny, but that cow is more important than a bouquet of roses. Historians still argue whether the peasantry had more freedom in choosing partners than the nobility, suggesting that when you have nothing to trade but your own strong back, you might at least get to pick whose back you labor beside. Yet, even here, the pressure is immense. The survival of the village depends on households that function like well-oiled machines, or perhaps, more accurately, like well-greased cart wheels. A man cannot bake his own bread or spin his own wool. Women cannot plow the heavy clay soil alone. They need each other, not for heart flutters, but to keep starvation at the door. It is a pragmatic intimacy, born of necessity. The air is thick with the weight of expectation. If you listen closely, you can hear the whispers of the village elders, the matchmaking aunts, and the local priest, all conspiring to ensure that the right fields are joined to the right flocks. There is a certain beauty in this gritty realism, a grim acknowledgement that life is hard and needs to be shared to be endured. As we float through this twilight, we realize that the filthy truth isn't just about dirt or scandal. It's about the messy, complicated entanglement of economics and biology. The velvet curtain of myth tries to hide the fact that a daughter was often a currency. In the stone corridors of the local lord's manor, looming high above the village, the air is colder, draftier, and smells faintly of roasting meat and old tapestries that haven't been dusted since the last crusade. Here, the stakes are higher, and the hearts are often colder. A noble daughter does not look at a cow. She looks at a map. Her marriage is a treaty inked in flesh. She is a peace offering sent to a rival neighbor to stop a border war, or a literal vessel for merging two coats of arms. We see a girl, perhaps only 12 or 13, sitting by a narrow window, picking at the embroidery on her sleeve. She has never met the man she will marry. She knows only his name, his rank, and the size of the dowry her father has grumbled about paying. There is a profound loneliness in this image, a silence that stretches across the centuries. We often imagine these historical figures as stiff and alien, like the figures in a stained glass window. But they felt the same flutter of anxiety in the stomach, the same fear of the unknown that we feel today. The difference is that they had no choice but to swallow it. The filthy part of our journey is the realization that their bodies were the bricks used to build the stability of the realm. And yet, human nature is stubborn. Even in this rigid system, we will see glimpses of rebellion, of stolen glances, and of a resilience that is breathtaking. We are not here to judge them by our standards, for that would be like blaming a candle for not being a light bulb. We are here to witness them. We are here to sit in the corner of the room, unseen ghosts, watching the dust motes dance in the shaft of light, acknowledging the heavy, scratchy wool against the skin, and understanding that for them, marriage was the trellis upon which the entire vine of society grew. It was the only way to be an adult, the only way to be a legal person, the only way to survive the winter. To understand the wedding, we must first understand the world that demanded it. It was a world of profound physical discomfort. The cold was a constant companion, seeping through the chinks in the wattle and daub walls, chilling the bones even under piles of fur. In this cold, a bedfellow was the most efficient heater available. It was a world of silence, where the night was absolute, broken only by the wind or the rustle of straw. In this silence, a partner was a guard against the terrors of the dark. And it was a world of filth, quite literally. The streets were open sewers, the water was often suspect, and disease was a roll of the dice. In this chaos, marriage was an attempt to create a clean line of descent, a small island of order in a sea of entropy. As we prepare to move deeper into this history, stripping away the layers of Victorian romance that have been plastered over the Middle Ages, we must accept that what we are about to see is not pretty. It is raw. It smells of unwashed bodies and fear, but also of fresh hay and roasted garlic. It sounds like the scratch of a quill on parchment and the clink of gold coins, but also like the soft humming of a lullaby in a drafty room. We are pulling back the velvet curtain to find that the machinery of marriage was greased with sweat and tears. The story we are weaving tonight is one of survival. As the sun sets fully in our imagination, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls, we prepare to look closer at the first step of this journey, the betrothal. It starts long before the wedding day, often before the participants can even tie their own shoes. It is a world where a promise is a legal shackle, and a ring is a heavy thing indeed. We drift now deeper into the night, ready to listen to the whispers of contracts and coins. The camera of our mind drifts slowly from the muddy village square, floating upward like wood smoke, through the narrow stone-framed window of a nursery in a minor lord's manor. It is quiet here, save for the rhythmic, raspy breathing of a child asleep in a wooden cradle. The air smells of sweet milk and stale rushes, a scent that defines infancy in the 12th century. We look down at the babe, perhaps only 3 or 4 years old, her cheeks flushed with the heat of sleep, her small fist clutching a rag doll made of scrap linen. To us, she is a child, a fragile being needing protection and play. To her father, standing in the doorway with a heavy, fur-lined cloak draped over his shoulders to ward off the draft, she is something else entirely. She is a chess piece. This is where the story of medieval marriage truly begins. Not at the altar, but here, in the cradle, long before the first tooth has fallen out. This section of our journey is called Sold Before the First Tooth, and it reveals the cold, hard bedrock of the marital institution, the betrothal. In the Middle Ages, you did not marry a person. You married a plot of land, a trade guild connection, or a non-aggression pact, and the person was merely the seal on the document. Standing beside the cradle, the father is not pondering his daughter's future happiness. He is calculating the yield of the harvest and the aggressive maneuvers of the neighbor to the north. He needs an alliance, and this sleeping toddler is his currency. It is a harsh truth to swallow in the soft light of the nursery candle. But we must understand that childhood itself was a different country then. Historians still actively debate the emotional landscape of medieval parenthood. For a long time, it was believed that parents remained emotionally detached from their children because infant mortality was so high. Why attach your heart to a flame that might snuff out in the next breeze? However, newer research suggests they loved their children fiercely, which makes what happened next even more tragic. They loved them, yet they sold them. This transaction was known as sponsalia de futuro, a promise of future marriage. It was a contract as binding as modern mortgage papers, and often far more difficult to escape. Imagine the scene, downstairs in the great hall, while the child sleeps unaware, her father is meeting with another man. They are drinking thick, spiced wine from silver goblets, their voices low and serious. Between them lies a piece of parchment, the skin of a sheep scraped smooth, covered in the dense, looping Latin of a cleric who sits nearby, dipping his quill into an inkpot made of oak galls. They are haggling, not over the price of grain, but over the price of the girl upstairs. The visitor has a son, perhaps 6 years old, currently busy in his own nursery miles away, likely trying to see if a pebble fits up his nose. A distinct lack of qualifications for a husband, one might think. But he is the heir to a fertile valley and a stone keep. The fathers are negotiating the portion, or the dowry. This was the money and goods the girl's family had to pay to the groom's family to take her off their hands. It is a reverse purchase, in a sense. If the girl is pretty, the price might drop slightly. If she is plain or her family's reputation is spotted, the price goes up. They argue over bolts of cloth, heads of sheep, and silver marks. When they finally agree, hands are clasped, a gesture of immense legal weight, and the betrothal is sealed. The children, the actual participants, are nowhere to be seen. They are legally infants, lacking the capacity to consent, yet the church and law allowed parents to make these binding promises on their behalf. Technically, the church set the age of reason at 7, the earliest a child could consent to a betrothal, and the age of marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. But in the high-stakes game of noble politics, these rules were mere suggestions, often bent or ignored with a special dispensation from a friendly bishop. We have records of children being betrothed in their cradles, literally swaddled in contracts. In 1160, Henry II of England betrothed his son, Henry, aged 5, to Margaret of France, who was barely a toddler. It was a political masterstroke involving a dowry of strategic castles. The fact that the bride and groom required naps and had not yet mastered full sentences was irrelevant. But let us not think this was only the misery of kings. Slide your mind's eye down. From the manor house to the village below, the stakes are smaller. A strip of farmland, a few pigs, access to the communal mill. But the dynamic is the same. A peasant father looks at his son and knows that, without a wife to brew ale, spin wool, and manage the garden, the boy will starve. He looks at his neighbor, who has a daughter and a shared boundary line. The match is made over a handshake in a muddy field. The peasant children might have a little more freedom to refuse later, as they had less property to lose. But the pressure of the yoke was universal. Marry where the land lies, the old saying went, and it meant exactly what it said. Romance was a dangerous variable that could ruin a good business deal. As the parchment in the manor hall is signed, hot wax is dripped onto the bottom of the page, a visceral red bleed against the pale skin of the document. The father presses his signet ring into the soft wax. It hardens. The fate of the sleeping girl upstairs is now set in stone. She is spoken for. From this moment on, she is raised not just as a daughter, but as a future wife of a specific house. She might be sent away to live with her future in-laws to be raised by them, ensuring she learns their customs and forgets her own family's bad habits. Imagine the disorientation of a 7-year-old girl, packed onto a pony, her small trunk of clothes tied behind her, riding away from the only mother she has known to live in the house of a strange boy who might pull her braids or ignore her entirely. She is a hostage to peace, a human bridge between two families who might otherwise be at each other's throats. There is a deep, resonant sadness in this, a loss of autonomy that begins before the child even knows what autonomy is. She grows up knowing she is property. Her value is constantly assessed. Is she growing straight? Are her teeth good? Is she learning her prayers and her needlepoint? She is an investment that must mature. If she dies before the wedding, the dowry might have to be returned, a financial catastrophe for her father, who has likely already spent it. So her health is guarded, not just for love, but for liquidity. As we watch the candle burn low in the nursery, the shadows lengthening across the sleeping child's face, we realize that the concept of single didn't really exist. You were a child, and then you were a spouse. The transition period, that modern era of self-discovery and dating, was a vacuum. You passed from the authority of the father to the authority of the husband, often without your feet touching the ground of freedom. The betrothal period could last for years, a long engagement of legal limbo. Sometimes, if the political winds changed, the betrothal was broken, a messy, legalistic divorce before the marriage even happened, leaving the girl damaged goods on the market. But usually, it held. It hung over the child's life like a storm cloud or a destiny, depending on the match. And as the ink dries on the contract downstairs, the invisible machinery of the church begins to turn. For a contract of flesh requires spiritual oversight. The local priest will soon need to be involved, for while the fathers have agreed on the sheep and the silver, the church insists on its say. The private deal must become a public declaration. The sleeping girl shifts in her crib, dreaming perhaps of a green field or a warm dog, unaware that her name is being written into a ledger that will dictate the rest of her life. The wind howls outside the stone walls, a lonely sound, reminding us that in this era, one does not face the cold alone, but the hand you hold is rarely one you chose. The silence of the room is heavy with the weight of the future, a future that has been bought and sold while she slept. The weeks turn into years, and the camera of our mind shifts its focus from the private shadows of the nursery to the public, echoing nave of the parish church. It is a Sunday morning, and the air is thick enough to chew. A haze of frankincense hangs in the shafts of blue-gray light, filtering through the narrow windows, battling the pervasive, damp smell of wet wool and unwashed humanity. The entire village is packed into this stone vessel, standing shoulder to shoulder. Pews are a luxury yet to be invented for the common folk. They shift on their feet, the rustle of their tunics creating a soft, restless ocean of sound. At the front, the priest ascends the wooden pulpit. He looks out over his flock, his eyes scanning for secrets. The private deal, made in the manor hall or the muddy field, must now survive the gauntlet of the public eye. This section of our journey is called The Banns and the Bishop's Eye, and it explores how the church inserted itself directly between the sheets of the marital bed. The priest clears his throat, a dry, authoritative sound that silences the shuffling crowd. He holds a slip of parchment, though he likely knows the names by heart. "I publish the banns of marriage," he intones, his voice bouncing off the cold stone walls, "between Thomas, son of the miller, and Alice, daughter of the weaver." He pauses, letting the names hang in the air like smoke. If any of you know cause or just impediment, why these two should not be joined together in holy matrimony, ye are to declare it. This is not merely a formality. It is a dragnet. For 3 consecutive Sundays, these names must be read aloud, a practice solidified by the Lateran Council of 1215 to crack down on the chaos of secret weddings. In a world without digital databases or identity cards, the community was the record keeper. The church needed the neighbors to act as spies. The tension in the room is palpable. For the young couple standing near the back, heads bowed, this is a moment of acute vulnerability. They are waiting for a voice to cry out from the crowd, and what could stop them? The church had created a labyrinth of rules so complex that a minotaur would get lost in them. The most terrifying of these was consanguinity, the prohibition against marrying relatives. In the early Middle Ages, the church forbade marriage within 7 degrees of relation. If you count back 7 generations, you are looking at thousands of ancestors. In a village of 300 people, where families had intermarried for centuries, finding someone who wasn't your cousin was a mathematical impossibility. It was a system almost designed to fail. Later, the church mercifully reduced this to 4 degrees, but the web remained sticky. A malicious neighbor with a grudge and a good memory for family trees could suddenly recall that the groom's great-grandmother was the bride's great-grandfather's second cousin. Objection. The wedding stops. The investigation begins. This wasn't just about biological incest. It was about spiritual incest too. Godparents were considered family. If your father was the godfather to your bride, you were technically siblings in the eyes of God, and the marriage was void. It is a wonder anyone in medieval Europe managed to get married at all. One has to smile at the absurdity of it. Trying to find a date in a medieval hamlet was essentially a game of dodge the relative, a game where the rules changed depending on who was keeping score. Historians still debate the extent to which the average peasant actually understood or cared about these complex theological webs. Some argue that rural communities largely ignored the stricter rules until a bishop came to visit, practicing a don't ask, don't tell policy regarding 4th cousins. Others suggest that the fear of living in sin was so potent that couples would agonizingly trace their lineage before daring to betroth. But for the nobility, these rules were a weapon. If a king or duke wanted to get rid of a wife who hadn't produced a son, he didn't need a divorce, which was impossible. He just needed a genealogist. He would suddenly discover that he and his wife were related in the 4th degree. Oh, the horror. We have been living in sin. The marriage would be annulled, the wife sent to a convent, and the king free to marry a younger, unrelated, or simply less related princess. The bishop's eye was often winking. But for Thomas and Alice, standing on the cold flagstones, there is no royal loophole. There is only the fear that someone will speak. The bans were a surveillance system. The church was asserting that marriage was not just a private contract between families, but a public sacrament under God's jurisdiction. It was a power grab, wresting control of the institution away from the secular lords and the clan patriarchs. By forcing the announcement, they ensured that the church had the final say on who could sleep with whom. It was the introduction of bureaucracy into romance. As the priest waits, silence stretches out. A baby cries in the back. Someone coughs. No one speaks against them. The first reading is safe. Only 2 more Sundays to go. But the regulation doesn't stop at the altar. The bishop's eye follows them home. The church had opinions on everything. They dictated the positions allowed, strictly missionary or the natural way, to minimize pleasure and maximize procreation, the times of day and the state of mind. To enjoy your spouse too much was considered adultery within marriage. You were supposed to love your wife, yes, but not with erotic madness. Saint Jerome, a particularly grumpy church father, had famously written that a man who loves his wife too passionately is an adulterer. Imagine the confusion this caused. Marry her, populate the earth. But for heaven's sake, don't look like you're enjoying it. The filthy truth here is psychological. It is the intrusion of guilt into the most private moments of human connection. The church taught that sexual desire was a result of the fall of man, a defect, a sickness. Even within marriage, sex was a remedy against concupiscence, a medicine to be taken to avoid the greater sin of lusting after others. It wasn't a celebration, it was a containment strategy. For the medieval mind, the bedroom was crowded. There was the husband, the wife, and the silent, judging presence of the bishop, holding a calendar of forbidden days. No sex on Sundays, God's Day, Fridays, penance, Wednesdays, often discouraged, feast days, and there were many, during Lent, 40 days, Advent, 4 weeks, or while the wife was menstruating, pregnant, or nursing. Some historians estimate that if a couple strictly followed all the rules, they might have been left with less than 1 day a week to legally conceive an heir. As the Mass ends and the villagers spill out into the graveyard, the air feels lighter. But the weight remains. Thomas and Alice glance at each other, a shy, terrified acknowledgement. They have cleared the first hurdle. The bans have been read. They are now publicly marked as intended. The community shifts its gaze upon them. They are no longer just individuals. They are a unit in the making. The scrutiny will only intensify. The transition from me to us is being forged in the fires of public opinion and religious law. The sun climbs higher, burning off the morning mist, but the stone walls of the church cast a long, cool shadow over the graves of their ancestors. Ancestors whose tangled bloodlines are the very thing threatening their union. The institution of marriage is revealing itself to be a cage, albeit a necessary one. It is built of laws, shame, and taxes, with bars made of gold rings and parchment scrolls. Yet, as they walk apart, for they cannot be seen walking together too boldly yet, there is a sense of momentum. The machine has started. The gears are grinding. The date is approaching. And before they can stand at the altar, they must be cleansed. The spiritual vetting is done. Now comes the physical scrubbing. The dirt of the fields, the grime of daily labor, and the scent of the old life must be washed away. We move from the cold judgment of the mind to the shivering reality of the skin. The bath awaits. The bans have been read, the contracts signed, and the spiritual hurdles cleared. Now, the narrative camera moves indoors, ducking under the low, thatched eaves of the bride's home. It is the eve of the wedding, or perhaps the very early blue-black hours of the morning. The air outside is biting, but inside, the room is thick with the humidity that feels foreign in this dry, draughty world. We are entering the domain of women, a temporary sanctuary where the groom and the father are forbidden. In the center of the room sits a large wooden barrel, the staves dark with age and moisture. A linen sheet has been draped inside it, not for luxury, but to save the bather's skin from splinters. This is the stage for a ritual as practical as it is symbolic: the wedding bath. This section, scrubbing away the common dirt, explores the rare and shivering transition from maiden to property, a moment where the body is prepared to be handed over like a polished artifact. We must first dismantle a pervasive myth that medieval people were universally allergic to water. The popular image of the filthy peasant who is born, lives, and dies without ever seeing a bar of soap is an exaggeration. While they certainly didn't shower daily with tropical scented gels, they understood that dirt was distinct from holiness. Hands and faces were washed daily, and public bathhouses were actually quite popular in cities, until the syphilis outbreaks of the 16th century shut them down. However, a full-body immersion bath in a private home, that was an event with a capital E. It required a staggering amount of labor. Firewood had to be chopped, water had to be hauled bucket by heavy bucket from the well or river, heated over the fire, and carried to the tub. In a world where fuel was expensive and labor was life, a hot bath was an extravagance, a burning of resources reserved for the sick, the wealthy, or the about to be married. Watch now as the female relatives bustle around the tub. The mother, the aunts, the sisters, they form a protective, chattering wall around the bride. They strip her of her tunic, the rough wool falling away to reveal the pale, goose-bumped skin beneath. There is no modern heating here. The room is likely hovering just above freezing, and the warmth of the water is a fleeting mercy. As she steps into the tub, the water is already turning grey. It is brown soap, or lye soap they use, a harsh, gelatinous mixture of animal fat and wood ash that cleans effectively but strips the skin of every ounce of oil, leaving it tight and raw. There are no loofahs, just rough cloths and vigorous scrubbing. The older women scrub her with a determination that borders on aggression. They are not just washing away the grime of the farmyard, they are scrubbing away her girlhood. They are washing away the scent of her father's house, the smoke of the hearth she grew up by, the sweat of the fields she played in. She is being neutralized, scoured clean, so she can be imprinted by a new owner. The water is scented with herbs, handfuls of dried rosemary, chamomile, and rose petals thrown in to mask the smell of the lye and the lingering odors of a life lived in close proximity to livestock. It creates a sensory confusion. The sharp, stinging soap mixed with the sweet, heady aroma of a garden. The bride sits with her knees drawn up, shivering despite the steam. She is silent. This is her body, but it feels less like hers than ever before. It is being appraised. The aunts cluck and comment. Is she too thin? Are her hips wide enough? Is that a blemish on her shoulder? In this moment, she is livestock being groomed for the county fair. The filthy truth is that her physical perfection, or lack thereof, is a topic of open discussion. Her body is the vessel for the future heirs, and the community feels entitled to inspect the merchandise. Historians often point out a fascinating dichotomy here. The church taught that the body was a source of sin, a cage for the soul that should be ignored or mortified. Yet marriage was the one area where the physical body was paramount. The theology crashed into the biology. The bride had to be modest, yet she had to be fertile. She had to be pure, yet she was being prepared for a consummation that was explicitly sexual. The bath walks this tightrope. It purifies her, making her a clean vessel. But it also highlights her physicality, drawing attention to the very skin and curves that the priests warned against. For a noblewoman, the scene is grander, but the water is just as wet. She might have a metal tub, perhaps draped with silk, and the soap might be imported from Castile, smelling of olive oil. But the chill in the air is the same, and the stakes are higher. Her body is a diplomatic instrument. If she has a hidden deformity, a birthmark that could be interpreted as an ill omen or a scar, this is the moment of anxiety. Will he reject her? The bath is a moment of truth. There are no corsets or veils to hide behind here. She is stripped to her essence. Let us add a touch of levity to the steam. One might wonder if the groom is receiving similar treatment. Is he being scrubbed with rose petals and fretted over? Unlikely. He might get a bucket of water over the head and a quick shave if he's lucky. The double standard begins here. He just needs to show up. She needs to be presented. As the water cools, the shivering intensifies. The women help her out, wrapping her quickly in linen towels that have been warmed by the fire, a brief, exquisite comfort. Now comes the hair. For years, as a maiden, she might have worn her hair loose or in simple braids, a symbol of her virginity and unmarried status. Today it is washed, combed out to its full length, one last time, dried by the heat of the fire. It is a golden or brown curtain that she hides behind. But this is the finale. After today, once the vows are said, her hair will be covered. The wimple, the veil, the headpiece, these are the symbols of a married woman. Loose hair is for children and prostitutes. By binding her hair up after the ceremony, she signals that her sexuality is now bound to one man. The bath is the last time she is fully open to the world. The water in the tub is now murky, a soup of dead skin and grey suds. It will be tossed out into the yard, feeding the muddy earth. The bride stands by the fire, her skin pink and scrubbed, smelling of ash and flowers. She feels light, perhaps too light. She has been shed of her past, but she has not yet put on her future. She is in the liminal space, the doorway. There is a vulnerability in this cleanliness. She is a blank page waiting for the ink. The noise from outside begins to intrude. The rooster has crowed. The village is waking up. The groom's party is likely already drinking ale, their boisterous laughter drifting on the wind. The silence of the bathing chamber is broken. The solemnity of the ritual gives way to the chaotic energy of the day. The women turn from washers to dressers. The filthy truth is that this bath, this singular act of hygiene, is the calm before the storm. She has been washed, not just to be clean, but to be worthy, worthy of the bed, worthy of the contract, worthy of the price paid. As the first layer of her wedding clothes, a fine linen shift, is slipped over her head, she disappears. The girl who's shivering in the tub is gone. In her place stands the bride. The shift settles on her shoulders, cool and smooth. It is the first layer of her armor. She takes a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the drying herbs one last time. She is ready to be decorated. She is ready to be led out. The private washing is done. The public performance is about to begin. The dirt is gone, but the stain of expectation remains. The wooden door of the cottage swings open, and the silence of the bathing chamber is instantly shattered. We are stepping out of the shadows and into a kaleidoscope. If the previous hours were defined by cold water and quiet tread, the wedding day itself is a sonic boom of color and noise. This section of our journey is called A Riot of Ribbons and Ale, and it invites us to witness the medieval wedding not as a solemn, hushed church service, but as a rowdy, chaotic street festival. It is a day where the village exhales. After months of grinding labor, strict penance, and grey skies, the wedding is a rare explosion of permitted joy, a pressure valve releasing steam in a cloud of dust and laughter. First, let us look at the bride as she steps into the sunlight. Forget the modern vision of pristine white silk. That is a Victorian invention, a ghost of Queen Victoria's influence centuries later. In the Middle Ages, white was the color of mourning or poverty, the color of undyed cheap cloth. A medieval bride wants to be seen. She is a riot of red, blue, and green. If she is a peasant, she is wearing her best dress, likely wool dyed with madder root to a rusty brick red, or woad to a deep earthy blue. She is draped in ribbons, flowers, and borrowed finery. Her hair, loose for the last time, is crowned with a circlet of fresh wild flowers, or, if her family has means, a wire chaplet of gilded silver. She is a walking harvest festival, a symbol of life and blooming fertility. The groom awaits her, and he is equally resplendent, perhaps sporting a tunic of shocking mustard yellow, or a cloak lined with bright squirrel fur. Together, they do not walk quietly to the church. They are paraded. This is the procession, and it is designed to be deafening. Listen to the soundscape. It is not the polite hum of an organ, but the banging of pots, the clashing of cymbals, the shrill cry of bagpipes, and the rhythmic thumping of drums. This cacophony has a purpose. In the medieval mind, the air is thick with unseen spirits, jealous fae, mischievous demons, and bad luck waiting to latch onto a new couple. The noise is a shield. It scares away the evil eye. It is a spiritual security system made of noise. The procession winds its way through the narrow, mud-slicked streets, gathering followers like a rolling snowball. Every dog in the village is barking. Every child is running alongside, hoping for a tossed coin or a sweetmeat. There is a raw, unrestrained energy here. It is earthy and loud. Jokes are shouted from windows, ribald, salty comments about the coming night that would make a modern grandmother faint. But here, they are greeted with roars of laughter. The filthy truth is that medieval piety often coexisted comfortably with a profound appreciation for the crude. They understood that marriage was about bodies, and they weren't shy about pointing it out. They arrive at the church, but they do not go inside. Not yet. This is a crucial distinction that often surprises modern minds. The actual marriage ceremony, the legal binding, happens in facie ecclesias, at the face of the church, on the porch, or the doorstep. The couple stands under the stone archway, suspended between the sacred interior and the secular world outside. It is here that the business is concluded. The priest stands on the threshold, a gatekeeper. Watch closely now, for money is about to change hands. The groom places coins on a book or a shield, 13 pieces of silver or gold, if he can afford it, a symbolic endowment. He then recites the vows. These words are ancient. In English history, the Sarum Rite gave us phrases that still echo today. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer. Hearing these familiar syllables in this strange, distant setting is a grounding anchor. But then comes the ring. The groom takes the ring, plain gold or perhaps iron, and slides it onto the bride's finger. But not just one. He places it on her thumb, in the name of the Father. Her index finger and of the sun, her middle finger, and of the Holy Ghost, and finally leaves it on the fourth finger. Amen. Why the fourth finger? Because the ancients believed a vein ran directly from that finger to the heart, the vena amoris. Even in this transaction of property, a thread of poetic anatomy survives. Once the ring is placed and the dower is declared, the husband loudly announcing what land or property is now hers if he dies, the deed is done. They are married. Now, and only now, do they enter the church for the nuptial mass. They walk down the aisle, not as two individuals approaching a union, but as a unified legal entity approaching God. The mass is long, chanted in Latin, swirling with incense that stings the eyes. The couple kneels, likely exhausted from the adrenaline and the weight of their finery. But the solemnity is a brief interlude. As soon as the "It missa est" is intoned, the real event begins. The feast. The camera pans from the cool, dark nave to the village green or the Lord's great hall. Long trestle tables have been set up, groaning under the weight of the food. For a peasant family, this feast represents months of savings. A cow has been slaughtered. Barrels of ale have been brewed. There is bread, not the hard black bread of daily survival, but softer, whiter loaves. There are pies filled with mystery meats and heavy spices to mask the lack of refrigeration. There is pottage, thick and rich. If this is a noble wedding, the spectacle is absurd. Roasted peacocks with their feathers reattached, castles made of pastry, fountains flowing with wine. But regardless of class, the atmosphere is the same: gluttony and release. The medieval world was one of feast and famine. When the harvest was in, you ate until you hurt, because you never knew when the lean times would return. The guests tear into the meat with their hands. Forks are a pretentious Italian invention that won't catch on for centuries, and wipe their grease-stained fingers on pieces of stale bread, which are then thrown to the dogs under the table. The noise is incredible. It is a wall of sound, chewing, shouting, singing, the clatter of wooden trenchers. The ale flows like a river. Everyone drinks, men, women, children, even the priest. Water is dangerous. Ale is safe, nutritious, and importantly, intoxicating. As the sun begins to dip lower, the edges of the gathering start to blur. The polite facade, thin to begin with, dissolves completely. The humor becomes bawdier. The dancing begins. Circle dances where hands are clasped and bodies spin until the world tilts. It is a chaotic swirl of color, the red and blue dresses blurring into a violet haze. Historians often pause here to debunk a particularly dark myth: the droit du seigneur, or the right of the first night, where the local lord allegedly had the right to deflower the bride before the husband. You can rest easy. There is virtually no evidence that this was ever a real law or a common practice. It appears to be a myth created by later generations to make the Middle Ages seem even more barbaric, or perhaps a literary trope used by medieval monks to complain about tyrant lords. The truth is, the lord was likely more interested in collecting a tax on the marriage than in the bride herself. It was about his wallet, not his lust. But even without the lord's interference, the bride and groom are not free. They are the center of the storm, but they are also trapped by it. They sit at the high table, on display. They must smile. They must drink. They must accept the coarse jokes of the uncles and the tearful embraces of the aunts. They are exhausted. The adrenaline of the morning has faded. replaced by the heavy, dull fatigue of being watched. The bride's head aches from the weight of her chaplet. The groom is likely tipsy, his face flushed. The light changes. The golden hour passes into the blue twilight. The torches are lit, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. The smell of the room shifts from roasting meat to the musk of sweating bodies and the smoke of dying fires. The energy of the crowd changes too. It shifts from celebratory to anticipatory. The dancing slows. The whispers begin. The guests are not just here to celebrate. They are here to witness the completion of the contract. The feast is merely the prologue. The main event, for the community, is the bedding. The couple exchanges a glance. It is the same glance shared by couples across millennia, a silent plea for escape. But in the medieval world, you cannot simply slip out the back door to a honeymoon suite. The crowd is coming with you. The riot of ribbons and ale is about to move upstairs. The public celebration must invade the private chamber, for in the filthy truth of the Middle Ages, privacy is a concept that simply does not apply to the marriage bed. The noise swells one last time, a crescendo of cheers and banging cups as the signal is given. It is time. The feast has blurred into a haze of spilled wine and exhaustion, yet the night is far from over. The camera of our narrative now follows the boisterous, stumbling crowd as it pushes away from the trestle tables and surges towards the bridal chamber. This is not a gentle retirement, it is an invasion. We are entering the most jarring chapter of the medieval wedding for the modern mind to comprehend, a section we call Witnesses by the Bedside. If the concept of privacy was a luxury in the castle hall, here in the bedroom, it is utterly extinct. In the 21st century, the honeymoon is a sacred, secluded getaway. In the 12th, it is a spectator sport. The filthy truth is that a marriage was not considered fully legal or binding until it was consummated, and because property, titles, and alliances hung in the balance, the community felt entitled, nay, obligated, to ensure the deed was done. Imagine the sensory overload of this moment. The room is likely small, the air instantly sucked out by the crush of bodies. It is hot, smelling of sweat, torch smoke, and the heavy, sweet scent of hippocras, a spiced wine that is passed around in a communal cup, meant to fortify the couple for the labor ahead. The guests are not here to be malicious. They are here to be witnesses. They are the living notary stamps on the contract. The bawdy jokes that were shouted across the banquet hall are now whispered right into the couple's ears, crude encouragements and drunken advice that make the bride's cheeks burn and the groom's jaw tighten. There is a frantic, chaotic energy to it, a mix of celebration and harassment. The ritual of undressing begins. It is a highly gendered performance. The bride is surrounded by her ladies, the matrons of the village or the noblewomen of the court. They strip away her finery, the heavy overdress, the linen shift, the stockings. It is a reversal of the morning's dressing. But where that was anticipatory, this feels predatory. Her hair is unpinned, falling loose around her shoulders again. She is being returned to her natural state. Across the room, or perhaps in an antechamber, the groom is undergoing a similar dismantling at the hands of his male companions. They slap his back, jeer, and make gestures that leave little to the imagination. He is being primed for performance. There is immense pressure on him here. If he fails to perform tonight, the whispers will start tomorrow. Impotence is grounds for annulment. It is a public humiliation that can unmake a man. But amidst this rowdy secular chaos, the church steps in once more. The priest pushes his way through the drunken throng, carrying a censer of incense and a sprinkler of holy water. This is a crucial, jarring juxtaposition, the sacred colliding with the sexual. The bed itself must be blessed. In the eyes of the church, the marital bed was a dangerous place, a zone where lust could easily curdle into sin. The priest sprinkles the sheets, the pillows, and the couple themselves with holy water, chanting prayers to drive away demons who might cause barrenness or discord. He prays that they will be fruitful, that they will be faithful, and that they will not enjoy themselves too much. It is a final spiritual sanitization before the biological act. The smoke of the incense curls around the bedposts, mixing with the smell of the spiced wine, creating a thick, heady atmosphere that is both holy and suffocating. Now the couple is placed in the bed. They sit up, propped against the pillows, naked or in simple shifts, while the room stares at them. This is the bedding ceremony. In some traditions, the guests would throw the bride's stockings, a chaotic precursor to the bouquet toss, where whoever caught the stocking would be the next to marry. In others, the priest would bless the couple one last time as they sat under the covers. The myth we must correct here is the idea that the crowd stayed to watch the actual act of sex. While history records a few bizarre, royal exceptions where courtiers lingered uncomfortably long to ensure the dynasty was secure, for the vast majority of people, the witnessing ended once the couple was tucked in. The curtains of the bed, heavy velvet drapes for the rich, rough wool blankets for the poor, would be drawn shut. This moment, the drawing of the curtains, is the symbolic closing of the public eye. But the reality is less absolute. The crowd does not vanish. They linger. They finish their wine. They might bang on the door or shout final jests through the wood. Eventually, slowly, they are ushered out by the parents or the steward. The door is closed. The heavy iron latch falls with a final echoing clank. And then silence. Or rather, a relative silence. The couple is alone in the dark, but the presence of the community is still felt. The air in the room is still warm from the breath of 50 people. The smell of the crowd lingers. And there is the knowledge that just on the other side of that door, people are listening. They are waiting for the morning evidence. The couple is left in the pitch black. Candles were expensive and fire was a risk, so darkness was total. To navigate the sudden, terrifying intimacy of two strangers who are now one flesh. This is the moment where the filthy truth becomes emotional. Strip away the politics and the rituals, and you have two frightened young people. The bride, perhaps only 14, has likely been given no instruction on what is about to happen, other than vague warnings of pain and duty. The groom, perhaps only slightly older, is fumbling with the weight of expectation and the clumsiness of inexperience. There is no romance here, only biology and obligation. The act itself is often quick, awkward, and devoid of the tenderness we associate with a wedding night. It is a transaction. She submits. He takes possession. It is the sealing of the deed. Historians debate how often this first night was traumatic versus merely awkward. The records are mostly silent, written by men who didn't think to ask the women. But we can infer from the church court records stories of women fleeing, of frigid men, of bruised bodies, that for many, This was not a night of love, but of endurance. Yet, in the resilience of the human spirit, some surely found a way to be gentle. Some surely whispered kind words in the dark, bridging the gap between stranger and spouse with a touch of humanity. We hope for that, at least. We hope that, in the quiet that followed the chaos, a hand reached out, not to claim, but to comfort. But the night does not belong to them. It belongs to the morning. As they lie there in the cooling dark, the physical reality of what has happened, the blood, the fluids, becomes the next piece of evidence. The morning gift awaits, and the inspection of the sheets. The bed is not a sanctuary. It is a crime scene of sorts, where the proof of virginity lost and marriage consummated must be preserved. The world outside the door has quieted, but it has not gone away. It is waiting for the sun to rise, to inspect the work of the night. The heavy velvet curtains around the bed insulate them for a few hours, a small, dark cocoon in a harsh world. They drift into sleep, side by side, their breathing slowly sinking. Two soldiers who have survived the opening battle of a lifelong war. The party is over. The marriage has begun. The first grey light of dawn creeps through the shutters, slicing through the darkness of the bridal chamber like a cold blade. It brings with it the inevitable return of the world. The heavy protective silence of the night lifts, replaced by the waking sounds of the household, the distant clatter of a pot in the kitchen, the crow of a rooster, the groan of timber settling. Inside the bed, the couple stirs. This is the moment the fairy tale officially ends. The camera of our mind lingers on this quiet, awkward morning, a scene rarely painted, but universally experienced. This section, The Silence of the Morning After, explores the harsh, blinding transition from the chaotic fantasy of the wedding to the stark, unvarnished reality of marriage. The bride wakes first. For a moment, she might forget where she is. She reaches for the familiar warmth of a sister or a mother, but her hand meets the rough, hairy shoulder of a stranger. The memory rushes back. The noise, the wine, the intrusion, the dark. She lies still, breathing shallowly, afraid to wake him. In the unforgiving light of morning, the glamour of the feast has evaporated. The garlands of flowers on the floor are wilted and brown. The air smells of stale incense and the sour, lingering odor of spilled ale. The man beside her is not the dashing figure in the mustard tunic she saw yesterday. He is a man with morning breath, perhaps snoring softly, a human being with whom she is now legally fused until death. But there is no time for existential dread. The door is about to open. The world is coming back in to check its investment. This brings us to one of the most intrusive and humiliating rituals of the medieval marriage, the inspection of the sheets. In many regions, particularly among the nobility and propertied classes, the morning brought a delegation of female relatives, mothers, aunts, the matriarchs of the clan, to the bedside. They were not there to bring breakfast. They were there to inspect the linens for blood. The filthy truth is that a woman's worth was often reduced to a red stain on a piece of hemp cloth. This stain was the receipt for the transaction. It proved two things: that the groom had done his duty, consummation, and that the bride had done hers, virginity. If the sheet was stained, there was relief. The honor of the families was intact. In some traditions, the sheet was triumphantly displayed to the waiting guests, a grotesque banner of victory that signaled the alliance was sealed. But if the sheet was clean, panic. It could mean the bride was not a virgin. A scandalous revelation that could lead to the marriage being annulled and the bride being sent home in disgrace. Her family's reputation shattered. Or it could simply mean, as we know biologically today, that the hymen had broken years ago during play or work, or was elastic enough not to bleed. The medieval understanding of anatomy was rigid and unforgiving. Women often knew this danger. Folklore whispers of desperate tricks, a pricked finger, a hidden vial of chicken blood, anything to manufacture the necessary evidence and survive the inspection. It was a terrifying gauntlet to run before one even had breakfast. Once the proof was accepted, the tone shifted from investigative to transactional. It was time for the morgengab, or the morning gift. This was a mandatory present given by the husband to the wife on the morning after the consummation. Unlike the dowry, which went from her father to him, this gift was for her. It was often a significant portion of his property, sometimes a specific plot of land, a sum of money, or valuable jewelry. In the eyes of the law, this was her insurance policy. If he died before her, the morning gift was the one thing she could claim as her own, separate from the rest of his estate. Watch as the husband sits on the edge of the bed, fumbling with a small wooden box or a parchment deed. He hands it to her. It is a strange, formal moment between people who were naked together just hours before. "For you," he mumbles. She takes it. This transaction shifts the power dynamic slightly. She is no longer just a vessel. She is a stakeholder. She has a claim. It is the first tangible benefit she has received in this long, exhausting process. She tucks the deed or the ring away safely. It is her lifeline. But then, the guests begin to leave. The castle or the cottage empties. The musicians pack up their lutes. The trestle tables are dismantled. The uneaten bones are swept to the dogs. The noise that shielded them yesterday, the cheers, the music, the laughter, drains away, leaving a silence that feels heavy and exposed. The couple is left alone in a way they weren't the night before. Now, there is no audience. There is just the two of them, standing in the debris of the celebration. They look at each other. The awkwardness is palpable. They are husband and wife, but they do not know each other's favorite color, or what makes them laugh, or what they fear. They are colleagues in a survival enterprise who have been hired without an interview. The modern expectation is that they should gaze lovingly and start their happily ever after. The medieval reality is that they probably just needed to get to work. There was no honeymoon. The concept of taking 2 weeks off to travel to a beach would have been laughable, if not insane, to a medieval peasant. Time was food. If it was harvest time, they were in the fields that very afternoon. If he was a smith, the forge needed firing. If he was a lord, the petitions were piling up. The wedding dress, the red or blue wool, is carefully folded and packed away into a chest. It might not be worn again for years, perhaps only for church on high holy days. She puts on her working clothes, the rough grey tunic, the apron. She covers her hair with the wimple, the white cloth that frames her face and marks her as occupied territory. The transition is brutal in its speed. One moment, she is the queen of the feast, the center of the universe. The next, she is a wife, expected to know where the salt is kept, how the husband likes his pottage, and how to manage a household she has just entered. The loneliness of the morning after is profound. She is in a strange house, with strange smells and strange in-laws who may or may not like her. She misses her mother. She misses the bed she slept in for 16 years. But she cannot go back. The bridge has been burned. As the sun climbs higher, burning off the morning mist, the weight of coverture settles on her shoulders. Legally, she has ceased to exist as an individual. She is femme couverte, a covered woman. Her name is now a subsection of his. If she is beaten, she cannot sue. If she earns a coin, it belongs to him. The morning light reveals the bars of the cage more clearly than the candlelight of the wedding ever could. Yet, there is a quiet resolve here too. Humans are adaptable creatures. She ties her apron strings tight. He picks up his tools. They exchange a nod, a small silent agreement to make this work, because there is no other option. They step out of the door, not into a carriage with tin cans trailing behind it, but into the mud and the wind. The festival is over. The silence of the morning is broken by the strike of a hammer or the lowing of a cow. The life they have been sold into has begun. The camera pulls back, leaving them to their first day of labor, a day just like any other, except now, they are two. The wedding finery is packed away in a cedar chest, and the taste of spiced wine is a fading memory. Now, we stand in the mud. The camera of our narrative lowers to ground level, focusing on a pair of cracked leather boots sinking into the wet, heavy clay of a furrowed field. This section of our journey is called the yoke of the field, and it strips away the last vestiges of courtly romance to reveal the muscular, sweating heart of the medieval marriage. The work, for the vast majority of the population, the 90% who tilled the earth, marriage was not a union of souls, but a business merger of two laborers. It was a survival strategy. To remain single was to court starvation. To marry was to double your odds against the wolf at the door. Imagine the sheer physicality of their days. The husband walks behind the plow, guiding the heavy wooden frame as it slices through the stubborn earth. It is back-breaking work, requiring immense upper body strength to keep the furrow straight while shouting commands to the oxen. He is the master of the outer economy. The grain, the large livestock, the boundaries of the farm. But look closer at the edge of the field. The wife is not sitting by the fire doing embroidery. She is there too, perhaps leading the ox or walking behind him with a bag of seed, casting it into the fresh earth with a rhythmic sweep of her arm. The myth of the medieval housewife who stayed indoors while her husband braved the elements is just that, a myth. In the peak seasons of planting and harvest, the fields were an all-hands-on-deck situation. The filthy truth is that peasant women were heavy laborers, their bodies as hardened by work as the men's. But her domain extended far beyond the furrow. While he focused on the single massive crop of wheat or barley, she managed the complex, diversified portfolio of the inner economy. She was the CEO of the garden, the dairy, and the brewery. Historians often emphasize this complementarity of the sexes. It wasn't that the man was the boss and the woman the servant. It was that they were two halves of a necessary whole. If he failed to plow, they had no bread. But if she failed to garden, milk the cow, or raise the chickens, they had no soup, no cheese, and no eggs. In many ways, her work was the daily cash flow that kept the family alive while they waited for the annual payout of the grain harvest. Consider the ale. In a world where water was often dangerous to drink, ale was the staple beverage, consumed by everyone from toddlers to grandparents. brewing was almost exclusively women's work, so much so that the term brewster or alewife was a common title. It was a hot, heavy, sticky job, hauling water and monitoring fermentation, but it was also profitable. A woman who brewed good ale could sell the surplus to her neighbors, bringing in vital coin to pay the lord's taxes. When you look at a medieval cottage, remember that it was also a factory, and the wife was the foreman. The metaphor of the yoke is not accidental. A yoke is a heavy wooden beam used to connect two animals so they can pull a load together. It restricts movement. It chafes the skin. It is heavy. But it also allows two beings to move a weight that would crush one alone. Medieval marriage was exactly this. The couple was yoked by necessity. If one stumbled, the other had to take the weight. This interdependence created a specific kind of intimacy, not the intimacy of shared secrets or poetry, but the intimacy of shared strain. They knew the rhythm of each other's work. He knew the sound of her churning butter. She knew the set of his shoulders when the blight appeared on the wheat. This partnership was tested by the seasons. In spring, they were muddy and hopeful, planting side by side. In summer, they worked from dawn until dusk, racing the sun to shear sheep and weed the garden. In autumn, the harvest demanded everything they had. Even heavily pregnant women were expected to bind sheaves of wheat until the labor pains began. And in winter, they retreated indoors, the world shrinking to the circle of light cast by the hearth. Here, the work changed but did not stop. He repaired tools and whittled. She spun wool. The distaff, the tool used to hold the unspun wool, became the universal symbol for womanhood. The spindle side and the spear side were legal terms for female and male lines of descent. There is a gritty sort of humor to be found in this relentless grind. Court records tell us of arguments that arose from the stress of this partnership. Husbands hauled before the village court for immoderate correction, of a wife who burnt the bread, or wives fined for scolding a husband who drank away the profits. One popular medieval trope in art was the battle for the breeches, depicting a wife beating her husband with a distaff to seize control of the household pants. It was a joke, but it revealed a truth. In the peasant cottage, the power dynamic was often more fluid than the laws suggested. A woman who brewed the best ale and managed the finances held a lever of power that no legal theory of coverture could fully erase. But the fragility of this unit was terrifying. If the husband died, the yoke fell to the ground. A widow was left with a plow she couldn't push and a field she couldn't defend. If the wife died, and she often did in childbirth, the husband was left with a dairy he couldn't manage and infants he couldn't feed. Remarriage was lightning fast in the Middle Ages, not out of disrespect for the dead, but out of panic. A widower might marry within weeks, needing a partner to survive the coming winter. We see records of men marrying the sisters or cousins of their late wives, effectively slotting a new partner into the existing machinery of the household. It seems cold to us, but to them, it was the logic of the lifeboat. Let us pause for a scholarly note. Historians still argue whether the Black Death, which killed nearly half of Europe in the mid-14th century, improved the status of these working women. The theory is that the sudden shortage of labor made workers, including women, more valuable. Wages rose, and women briefly delayed marriage to work and earn their own money, a phenomenon known as the European marriage pattern. For a fleeting moment, the yoke loosened. Young women could afford to say no, or at least not yet, buying themselves a few years of independence before clamping the wooden beam back onto their shoulders. But for our couple, dragging their feet through the mud of the 12th or 13th century, that future is far away. The sun begins to set, turning the furrows into ribs of shadow. They walk back to the cottage, their bodies aching in unison. They are dirty, smelling of sweat and manure. There is no romance in the way they scrape the mud from their boots at the door. But as they sit by the fire, sharing a bowl of pottage, a thick vegetable stew, lightly flavored with a bit of salted pork, there is a profound, silent bond. They have survived another day. They have pulled the cart a few miles further down the road. The filthy truth of the field is that it destroyed the body, but forged the unit. Their marriage is not held together by a piece of paper or a ring, but by the fact that they are the only thing standing between each other and the void. As the fire dies down, they do not speak of their dreams. They speak of the cow's cough, the price of salt, and the leak in the roof. It is a language of survival, unpoetic and essential. They crawl into the bed, straw stuffed into a sack, and the heat of their bodies is the only luxury they own. They sleep the sleep of the exhausted, gathering strength for the sun to rise and the yoke to be lifted once more. The seasons turn, the wheat is harvested, and the snows melt. But for the woman in the cottage or the castle, the calendar is marked not by the sun, but by the swelling of her own body. The camera of our narrative moves now from the open, muddy fields to the claustrophobic, heat-soaked interior of the birthing chamber. We have arrived at the most dangerous battlefield of the Middle Ages. It was a battlefield where no swords were drawn, yet where death walked as freely as any soldier. This section is called The Candle in the Birthing Chamber, and it brings us face to face with the primal terror and the fierce, exclusionary power of medieval childbirth. The filthy truth is that while men fought wars for land, women fought wars for life, and the casualties were just as high. To understand the atmosphere, you must first understand the darkness. As the labor pains begin, sharp, rhythmic tightenings that stop the breath, the world of the mother shrinks to the size of her room. The windows are shuttered tight, and heavy tapestries or blankets are nailed over every crack. This was not just to keep out the draft. It was to keep out the light and the night air, which were believed to be harmful to the mother's open, vulnerable state. But more importantly, the darkness was a shield against the supernatural. The medieval mind believed that during childbirth, the veil between the living and the dead was dangerously thin. Demons, fairies, and changelings were thought to be lurking, waiting to snatch the newborn soul or curse the mother. So, the room is sealed. It becomes a womb within a womb, hot, airless, and lit only by the flickering light of expensive beeswax candles, perhaps blessed by a priest for this specific hour. As the contractions intensify, the dynamic of the household undergoes a radical shift. For the first time, the patriarchy is evicted. The husband, the lord, the master of the house, he is told in no uncertain terms to get out. He is banished to the hall or the courtyard to pace and pray. The birthing chamber becomes an exclusively female fortress. The gossips arrive, not in the modern sense of rumor mongers, but from the Old English godsib, meaning god siblings or spiritual kin. These are the neighbors, the sisters, the mothers who gather to help. They bustle in with purpose, carrying clean linen, basins of hot water, and calming words. They create a circle of protection, a wall of estrogen and experience around the laboring woman. At the center of this storm stands the midwife. She is the general of this army. In a world where university-trained physicians were all men who relied on ancient Greek texts and astrology, the midwife was the empiricist. She knew the body. She had seen 100 births. Her knowledge was in her hands, not in a book. She brings her kit, herbal salves to rub on the belly, oil to stretch the skin, and perhaps a knife for the cord. But she also brings the filthy truth of superstition. Mixed with medicine, she might open every lock, latch, and drawer in the house, a sympathetic magic believed to help open the womb. She might place a piece of jasper or coral on the woman's thigh to speed the labor. The pain is the dominant reality here, and it is a pain that the church had a complicated relationship with. According to Genesis, this was the curse of Eve. In sorrow, thou shalt bring forth children. Pain was the penalty for the original sin. Therefore, trying to alleviate it too much was sometimes seen as dodging God's will. There were no epidurals, no nitrous oxide. The woman had to ride the waves of agony with nothing but grit and prayer. She might be given a caudle, a warm spiced drink of ale, milk, and eggs to keep her strength up. She might clutch a relic. Wealthy monasteries made a fortune renting out birth girdles, strips of parchment inscribed with prayers, or, in some cases, claimed to be the actual belt of the Virgin Mary, which were wrapped around the laboring woman's belly. It was a placebo, perhaps, but in a room thick with fear, belief was a powerful drug. Historians still debate the reputation of the medieval midwife. For centuries, later writers demonized them as ignorant crones or witches, but modern research reveals them as highly respected, competent professionals who navigated a biological minefield. They knew how to turn a breech baby. They knew when to intervene and when to wait. They were the guardians of the threshold, but they were also the baptizers of last resort. If the baby was stuck, if the silence stretched too long, the midwife had the ecclesiastical authority to perform an emergency baptism. She would splash water on a protruding foot or a crowning head and whisper the formula. This was the darkest fear, not just the death of the child, but the damnation of its soul. An unbaptized infant could not enter heaven. They were relegated to limbo, a place of eternal suspension. The pressure on the midwife to secure that spiritual safety net was immense. The atmosphere in the room is heavy, smelling of sweat, blood, metallic iron, and the sweet smoke of the candles. The women chant prayers. They wipe the mother's brow. There is a raw, primal solidarity here that men were never privy to. It is a secret history of women, written in fluids and cries. The mother is often positioned, not lying down, but sitting on a birthing stool, a horseshoe-shaped chair that allowed gravity to do its work. She is supported from behind by a friend, literally held up by her community. And then, the moment of truth. The baby arrives. The room holds its breath. That split second of silence before the first cry is the longest silence in human history. When the wail comes, the tension snaps. Tears, laughter, the rush to cut the cord and swaddle the infant in tight bands of linen to ensure its limbs grow straight. The husband is finally allowed back in, usually to be presented with the child, his anxiety resolving into relief or grief. But the danger is not over. The filthy truth is that death often stalked the mother, in the days after the birth. Puerperal fever, childbed fever, was a bacterial infection caused by the lack of sterility. No one knew about germs. The midwife's hands, the unwashed linens, the very air of the stuffy room could carry the invisible killer. A woman might survive the agony of the birth, only to succumb to a raging fever 3 days later. It was a lottery. Queen or peasant, the risk was democratically cruel. The wills of pregnant women from this era are heartbreaking documents, listing who should get their best dress or their rosary beads, written by women who knew they were walking into the valley of the shadow of death. If she survived, she was not yet free to re-enter society. She was considered unclean. This wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. She had been involved in the messy, bloody business of creating life, which, in the church's eyes, required a period of separation. She would enter a period of lying in, staying in her room for up to a month. While this was a restriction, it was also a mercy, a mandatory maternity leave, where she was exempt from housework and cooking, fed rich foods, and allowed to recover. The final act of this drama was churching. About 40 days after the birth, the woman would walk to the church, often carrying a candle. The priest would meet her at the door. She was not allowed inside yet, and sprinkle her with holy water, reciting a psalm of purification. He would then lead her back into the church, symbolically readmitting her to the community of the faithful. It was a ritual of cleansing, yes, but also of thanksgiving. She had survived the war. She had brought life back from the brink of death. As the camera pulls back from the birthing chamber, leaving the mother nursing her infant in the soft, golden light of the fire, we are left with a profound sense of respect. The medieval marriage was a system of production, and this was the factory floor. It was brutal, bloody, and terrifying. But in that hot, dark room, surrounded by her sisters and neighbors, the medieval woman found a power that no king could command. She was the gatekeeper of existence. The candle burns low, casting long shadows on the wall, shadows that look like the generations that will come after. All of them owing their breath to this singular, perilous act. The baby sleeps, unaware of the cost of its arrival. The mother sleeps, knowing she has paid it. The camera of our imagination leaves the warm, blood-scented intimacy of the birthing chamber and travels miles away, drifting through the heavy oak doors of a municipal building. We are entering a world devoid of soft linens and whispered comforts. The air here is dry, smelling of pulverized rags, iron gall ink, and the dust of centuries. It is a room of silence, broken only by the aggressive scratching of a quill against parchment. We have arrived in the domain of the law. This section of our journey is called The Heavy Hand of Authority, and it explores how the vibrant, breathing woman we just left, the one who manages the dairy, brews the ale, and births the heirs, is systematically erased by the stroke of a pen. The filthy truth of medieval marriage is not just about physical labor or biological risk. It is about a legal fiction so powerful it could turn a living human being into a ghost. To understand this, we must look over the shoulder of the scribe hunched at his desk. He is writing in Latin, the language of power, a code that the vast majority of women and many men cannot read. He is recording a property dispute. As he writes, he employs a concept that serves as the bedrock of English common law regarding marriage, coverture. The principle is deceptively simple and sounds almost romantic in a poetic sense. Husband and wife are one person in law. It echoes the biblical idea of one flesh, but the scribe knows the grim punchline that follows. And that person is the husband. Watch as the ink dries. It seals a reality where, the moment the wedding vows were spoken, the woman's legal identity was suspended or covered by her husband. She became a femme couverte. Before marriage, as a widow or a spinster, she might have had rights. She could own land, sign contracts, or sue a neighbor who stole her pig. But the instant the ring slid onto her finger, those rights evaporated. She could no longer own property. Everything she brought to the marriage, from her dowry of silver spoons to the clothes on her back, became his. She could not write a will, for she had nothing to give. She could not sign a contract, for her signature had no weight. She could not be sued, nor could she sue anyone, even if they beat her in the street. To the eyes of the law, she had ceased to exist as an independent entity. She was merely an extension of her husband's arm. Historians still argue about the practical severity of this system. This is where the scholarly debate gets interesting. Was coverture a total totalitarian cage, or was it a theoretical framework that people ignored when it was convenient? We see evidence of both. In the chaotic, face-to-face world of the village, everyone knew that Alice was the one who brewed the best ale, and that the money in the jar was effectively hers. Custom often trumped law, but in the cold, hard courts of the nobility or the growing cities, the law was a weapon. If a husband was a gambler or a fool, he could legally sell his wife's land, spend her dowry, and leave her destitute, and she had absolutely no legal mechanism to stop him. She was a passenger in a carriage with no brakes, and he was holding the reins. Let us add a touch of dark humor to this legal absurdity. The doctrine of unity of person led to some bizarre legal contortions. For instance, a husband and wife could not steal from each other because you cannot steal from yourself. Furthermore, if a wife committed a crime in the presence of her husband, the law often assumed she had been coerced by him because she had no will of her own. He would hang, she might walk free. It was a rare grim perk of being considered a non-entity. You couldn't be held responsible because you weren't technically there in the eyes of the judge. But the camera shifts now to a scene that is far less amusing. We see a courtroom, a manorial court held in the great hall of a local lord. A woman stands before the bailiff. She is trying to speak, her voice trembling with frustration. She has been wronged. Perhaps a merchant cheated her, or a neighbor encroached on her garden. But the bailiff looks right through her. He looks at her husband, who stands beside her, perhaps indifferent or even hostile to her cause. "Let the man speak," the bailiff says. Her words are wind. Her testimony is inadmissible without his endorsement. This is the psychological violence of coverture, the enforced silence. It is the feeling of screaming behind a glass wall. The filthy truth gets darker when we consider correction. Because the husband was legally responsible for his wife's conduct, just as he was for his children or his servants. The law gave him the right to discipline her. This brings us to the infamous rule of thumb. You may have heard the myth that a man was legally allowed to beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb. In reality, no such specific law existed in the Middle Ages. That is a later satirical invention. However, the truth was hardly better. Common law allowed for reasonable chastisement. A husband could beat his wife for disobedience, just as he would a child. The church courts only stepped in if the violence was life-threatening or caused permanent maiming. Castigation beyond measure. Imagine the atmosphere of a village where everyone hears everything. If a neighbor heard screams in the night, they might gossip, they might judge, but they rarely intervened. It was a private matter. The legal system effectively privatized violence against women, hiding it behind the closed doors of the cottage. Only when a wife turned up dead, or with broken bones, did the machinery of justice creak into motion. And even then, the defense of provocation was a powerful shield for the husband. She scolded me, he might say. She would not be silent. In a culture that prized female silence as a virtue, a scold was a villain. We see this fear of the vocal woman in the invention of the scold's bridle or the branks, though these torture devices became more common in the later early modern period. In the medieval era, a woman who spoke out too freely, who challenged her husband's authority or disrupted the peace with her unruly tongue, might be sentenced to the cucking stool. This was a chair suspended over a river or a pond. The woman was strapped in and ducked into the freezing water, a public humiliation designed to cool her temper and silence her voice. The community gathered to watch, laughing and jeering. It was a piece of street theater where the moral was clear. A woman's authority ends where her husband's patience begins. Yet, we must also look for the cracks in the wall. The camera zooms in on a bustling marketplace in a city like London or York. Here, the sheer necessity of commerce forced the law to bend. We see women selling fish, weaving silk, and running taverns. If coverture was strictly applied, commerce would grind to a halt because a woman couldn't sign a deal for a barrel of herring without her husband present. So, the cities invented the status of femme sole, a lone woman for business purposes. A married woman could register as a femme sole trader. This legal loophole allowed her to sign contracts, sue for debts, and run a business as if she was single, even while her husband sat at home. It was a pragmatic concession to capitalism. Money, it turns out, is the one force stronger than patriarchy. We watch a woman in a linen cap haggling fiercely over the price of wool. She is sharp, confident, and legally armed. She hands over a coin and makes her mark on a ledger. For this moment, in the noise of the market, she is free. She is a person. But as soon as she packs up her stall and walks home, crossing the threshold of her door, the cloak of coverture settles back onto her shoulders. The money she earned technically belongs to her husband, though she might hide it in a cracked pot by the hearth. The sun sets over the town, casting long shadows across the courthouse and the market square. The heavy hand of authority is everywhere, in the parchment scrolls of the archive, in the judge's gavel, in the bruises on a woman's arm, and in the silence that falls over a room when a husband enters. It is a system designed to maintain order by designating a captain for every ship, even if the ship is just a two-room hovel. The woman is the crew. She may steer, she may row, she may keep the vessel afloat, but the logbook will never bear her name. As night falls, we feel the weight of this erasure. It is a heaviness that sits in the chest, a reminder that for centuries, half of humanity lived as guests in their own lives. Subject to the whims of a landlord, they promised to obey until death. The law is a cold bedfellow, indeed. The heavy oak doors of the courthouse slam shut, sealing away the cold logic of the law. But the human heart is not made of parchment. It cannot be rolled up and filed away in a dusty cabinet. The camera of our narrative now scales a high stone wall, slipping past the iron spikes and the patrolling guards to drop us into the twilight sanctuary of a secluded garden. The air here is different. It does not smell of old ink or wet wool. It smells of crushed violets, damp moss, and dangerous secrets. This section is called Secret Loves and Locked Gates, and it explores the shadow world of medieval emotion. If marriage was a contract signed in the harsh light of day, love was a crime committed in the dark. We must understand a fundamental paradox of the medieval psyche. They were obsessed with love precisely because they were denied it. The 12th century saw the birth of a cultural phenomenon known as finamore, or courtly love. It started in the sun-drenched courts of Aquitaine, where troubadours strummed lutes and sang of a passion so intense it was akin to a fever. But notice the target of this passion. It was never one's own spouse. To love one's wife with erotic madness was, as the church said, a sin. To love her with courtly passion was considered boring or simply irrelevant. Romance was defined by its impossibility. The ideal lover was a knight, and the ideal beloved was a lady of higher station, usually the wife of his lord. Imagine a young knight sitting on a stone bench in this garden. He is pining. He writes poetry that compares his lady's eyes to stars and her skin to milk. He vows to serve her, to suffer for her, to die for her, but he rarely touches her. This was the safety valve of feudal society. By channeling sexual tension into an elaborate game of spiritual adoration, the pressure was released without threatening the social order. It was an emotional affair sanctioned by custom. The filthy truth, however, is that this game was a razor's edge. If the knight climbed the vine, if the adoration turned physical, the game became treason. Historians still argue whether courtly love was an actual social practice or merely a literary fantasy, a medieval version of celebrity gossip magazines. Did knights really swoon over their lords' wives? Or did they just enjoy singing about it while they drank wine? The answer likely lies in the middle. It offered a script for feelings that had no place in the arranged marriage. It validated the idea that love was something you suffered, something that struck you like an arrow, not something you built over a bowl of pottage. But what of the real affairs? The camera pans to a shadowed alcove where two figures stand too close together. The danger here is visceral, for a man, especially a powerful one. Infidelity was a venial sin, a lapse of judgment often met with a wink. Kings had mistresses, lords had natural children, who were often raised in the castle alongside the legitimate heirs. It was a display of virility, but for a woman, the double standard was a trapdoor over a pit of spikes. A woman's body was the vessel of the bloodline. If she slept with another man, she wasn't just breaking a vow, she was potentially corrupting the inheritance. She was stealing the Lord's legacy by planting a cuckoo in the nest. Therefore, the penalties for female adultery were terrifyingly physical. We see the legal codes of the time, and they are brutal. A husband who caught his wife in the act was often legally permitted to kill her on the spot. If she was spared death, she might face public shaming. One specific punishment haunts the records: the cutting off of the nose. It was a punishment designed to destroy the very beauty that had caused the sin. A woman without a nose was marked forever, a walking skull, hideous to behold, ensuring she would never tempt another man. It was a cruel, permanent scarlet letter carved into the face. Other punishments included being whipped through the streets in only a shift, or being locked away in a convent for the rest of her natural life, a civil death, where she was erased from the world of the living. And yet, despite the axe and the convent, people risked it. The church courts are cluttered with cases of fornication and incontinence, not just among the highborn, but in the villages too. We see records of peasants fined for lecherous behavior in the haylofts or the back of the mill. The human drive for connection, for a touch that was chosen rather than assigned, was a weed that grew through the cracks of the deepest pavement. This brings us to the locked gate. The anxiety over female sexuality led to an architecture of control. We see the high walls of the ladies' quarters, the chaperones, older, stern women assigned to watch the young maidens like hawks. We must address the most famous myth of all, the chastity belt. The popular image of a metal contraption locked around a woman's waist while her husband went on crusade is almost certainly a fabrication. Most museum examples are 19th century fakes made to titillate Victorian audiences. A medieval blacksmith would have known that wearing iron against the skin for months would result in sepsis and death, not fidelity. The true chastity belt was social, not metal. It was the gossip of the neighbors, the eye of the priest, and the threat of the nose knife. But let us return to the garden. It is here, in the stolen moments, that we see the tragedy of the medieval heart. Imagine a woman married at 14 to a man of 40 whom she fears. She meets a young squire in the garden. They exchange a glance, a touch of the hand. In that moment, she feels seen. She feels like a protagonist in her own life, not just a prop in her husband's. This is the seduction of the secret love. It wasn't just about sex, it was about autonomy. To choose a lover was the only rebellion available to a piece of property. The literature of the time is obsessed with this rebellion. The story of Lancelot and Guinevere, or Tristan and Isolde, captivated medieval audiences not because they were moral tales, but because they were true to the hidden landscape of the heart. They wept for the lovers because they understood the cage. They knew that duty was a heavy cloak that suffocated the soul. However, the filthy truth is that these affairs rarely ended in a romantic sunset. They ended in blood, exile, or ruin. The discovery of an affair could bring down a noble house. It could lead to private wars between families. In the village, it could lead to a charivari, a rough music procession where the community would surround the sinner's house, banging pots and mocking them, shaming them back into conformity. The sun has set completely now. The garden is dark, filled with the chirping of crickets and the rustle of unseen things. The lovers must part. The risk is too great. The heavy wooden door of the manor house creaks open, swallowing the woman back into the safety and suffocating boredom of her marital duty. The knight remains in the shadows, nursing a love that is half performance, half agony. We leave them there, separated by the walls of law and custom. The romantic poets would have us believe that love conquers all. The medieval reality was that the system usually won. The walls were too high, the gates too locked, but the fact that they tried, that they wrote the poems, stole the kisses, and risked the knife, tells us that the human spirit refused to be fully domesticated. As we move away from the scent of violets and fear, we prepare to enter the final phase of the marriage cycle. The heat of youth fades, the dangerous games of the garden are left behind, and we settle into the long grey endurance of the years. We move from the secret love to the shared life, where a different, quieter kind of bond is forged in the smoke of the hearth. The years have rolled by like a heavy wagon wheel, crushing the delicate flowers of the wedding garland into the dust of memory. The camera of our narrative now settles into the dim, smoky interior of the cottage or the castle solar, decades after that first terrifying night. The bright, sharp colors of youth have faded. The hair is streaked with iron gray. The skin is mapped with the lines of laughter and worry. The backs are bent from the weight of the yoke. We have arrived at the season of endurance. This section is called The Scent of Shared Winters, and it explores the quiet, undocumented miracle of the medieval marriage, the love that grows not from poetry, but from the grime and grit of survival. The filthy truth here takes on a literal meaning. In a world where bathing was an ordeal and deodorant did not exist, intimacy was an olfactory experience. They knew the smell of each other's sweat, the scent of the wood smoke that clung to their clothes, the stale breath of mornings after a long winter night. But in this shared filth, a profound comfort was born. Modernity sells us the idea that mystery is the key to romance, that we must keep some things hidden to maintain desire. The medieval couple had no such luxury. They slept in the same bed, often with the children, ate from the same trencher, and used the same chamber pot. There was no mystery. There was only the raw, unvarnished reality of another human being. And yet, historians argue that this lack of privacy fostered a bond that is difficult for us to comprehend. It was a corporeal transparency. They were not just partners. They were extensions of one another's physical selves. We see this in the intimate act of grooming. Imagine the couple sitting by the fire on a cold evening. The husband rests his head in the wife's lap. She is not reciting sonnets. She is delousing him. She is picking through his hair, searching for the nits that were a universal plague of the era. It sounds repulsive to the modern ear, a scene of squalor. But look closer at the body language. It is a gesture of immense care. It is a primate grooming ritual, a way of saying, I will take care of the things you cannot reach. It is a moment of peace in a life of ceaseless labor. The firelight softens their faces, and in the rhythm of her fingers, there is a language of affection that transcends the legal contracts. This is where the filthy truth softens into something warmer. While the church preached that marriage was for procreation and the law said it was for property, the people themselves often found a third way: companionship. The word husband comes from the Old Norse husbandi, meaning house dweller or tiller of the soil. It implies stability, as the sexual urgency of youth faded, tempered by the exhaustion of work and the cooling of the humors. The relationship often shifted into a deep, pragmatic friendship. They were the survivors of their own history. They had buried parents. They had likely buried children, a grief that either breaks a couple or fuses them together with a strength harder than iron. We find glimpses of this tenderness in the letters of the literate class. We see husbands addressing their wives not as madam or wife, but as my dear heart, my true love, or my sweet life. The Paston Letters, a treasure trove of 15th century correspondence, reveal wives who managed their husbands' estates with fierce competence and husbands who worried about their wives' health with genuine anxiety. When a husband was away on business or war, the wife was his eyes, his ears, and his proxy. He trusted her not because the law told him to, but because she was the only one who knew where the money was buried and which neighbor was a liar. Let us add a touch of humor to this domestic tableau. The medieval nag is a stock character in comedy, the wife who henpecks her husband, but flip the script. We also have accounts of husbands who were essentially man-babies when they got sick, relying entirely on their wives' herbal remedies and patience. A 14th century medical manual suggests that if a husband is melancholic, the wife should cheer him with singing and scratching his back. One can imagine the wife rolling her eyes, putting down her spinning, and scratching the back of a grumpy, bearded man who has a cold, muttering, "For better or for worse, indeed." But the winter is real. The cold of the medieval world was a physical antagonist. As they aged, the need for warmth became the central organizing principle of their lives. The bed was the warmest place in the house. They huddled together under the pile of furs or wool blankets, their bodies acting as mutual radiators. This physical clinging was a necessity, but it fostered a psychological clinging too. In the darkness of the winter solstice, when the sun set at 3 p.m. and the wolves howled in the forest, the breathing of the person beside you was the only proof that you were not alone in the void. This shared life created a shared mind. After 30 years, they no longer needed to speak to communicate. A look across the room told him that the stew was salty. A clearing of his throat told her that the guest was overstaying his welcome. This is the peace of the long marriage. It is not the fiery, courtly love of the troubadours, which burns hot and consumes. It is the glowing embers of a peat fire, low, constant, and capable of keeping the cold at bay for a long, long time. However, we must not romanticize the hardship. The bodies sitting by that fire are broken. He likely has a hernia from lifting. She has a prolapse from childbirth. Their teeth are worn down from grit in the bread, or missing entirely. They are in chronic pain. The filthy truth is that medieval people aged rapidly. A 40-year-old might look 60 to our eyes. They were weathered, scarred, and tired. The marriage was a nursemaid. They took turns caring for each other's ailments. When his eyes failed, she became his reader. When her joints seized up, he carried the water. There is a poignant legal concept called the jointure. While covetures stripped a wife of her property, wise fathers and careful husbands often set up a jointure, a provision of land or income that would support the wife if she outlived her husband. It was a recognition of her vulnerability, but it was also a recognition of her contribution. A husband who loved his wife wanted to ensure she didn't starve when he was gone. In the wills of the period, we see men leaving their wives not just the mandatory third of their estate, but my best bed, my silver cup, and explicit instructions to the children to treat your mother well, as you value my blessing. These legal documents are dry, but they weep with concern. The camera lingers on the couple's hands. His are calloused, the knuckles swollen, stained with soil. Hers are rough, the skin burned by lye and fire. They rest near each other on the table, perhaps touching. There is no electricity in the room, only the wavering light of the tallow dip. The shadows dance on the walls, shadows of the children who grew up and left, or the children who never grew up at all. The silence is not empty. It is full of shared history. They know the same stories. They fear the same ghosts. They are no longer the boy who stared at the cow or the girl who shivered in the bath. They are something else entirely, a single organism of survival, forged in the fires of adversity. They have scrubbed the floor, buried the dead, and paid the taxes together. As the wind rattles the shutters, they do not flinch. They simply pull the blanket tighter. The passion of the garden is gone, but in its place is the granite solidity of the hearth. They have weathered the storm, and as we watch them bank the fire for the night, covering the coals with ash to keep them alive for the morning, we realize that this, too, is a kind of romance. It is the romance of the ember that refuses to go out. The fire that burned in the hearth for 40 years has finally gone out. The labored breathing that filled the room during the long nights has ceased, leaving a silence so absolute it rings in the ears like a bell. The camera of our narrative now stands in the center of the main hall, watching a solitary figure draped in heavy black wool. The mirror has been turned to the wall. The shutters are drawn. We have arrived at the final paradoxical chapter of the marital life cycle. Widowhood. This section is called The Black Veil and the Key, and it unveils the strange, terrifying liberation that death brings to the medieval woman. The filthy truth is that for many women, the end of a marriage was the beginning of their lives as legal adults. The funeral is over. The professional mourners have been paid their pennies to wail. The priest has chanted the Requiem Aeternam. The body of the husband, the plowman, the lord, the partner in the yoke, is now resting in the consecrated ground of the churchyard. The guests have eaten the funeral baked meats and drunk the ale, murmuring their condolences before returning to their own lives. The widow is left standing in the debris of the wake. She feels a profound grief, a tearing of the soul, for she has lost the witness to her life. But as she reaches into the pocket of her black gown, her fingers close around a cold iron object, the key. For the first time in her life, the key belongs to her. Under the harsher doctrine of coverture, she was a shadow. Now, the sun of the law shines directly on her. She has transformed from a femme couverte to a femme soul, a woman alone. The legal fiction that erased her identity has dissolved. She can now own property in her own name. She can sign contracts. She can sue the neighbor who moved the boundary stone. She can write a will. She can run the business. If she is a noblewoman, she becomes a dowager, a title that carries immense weight. She controls her dower, the 1/3 of her husband's estate, guaranteed to her by law, plus whatever jointure he left her. She is suddenly a woman of means, a power player on the board. This sudden agency is dizzying. We watch her walk through the house. She opens the chest where the silver is kept. She counts the spoons. No one can sell them without her permission. She walks out to the barn. The cows are hers. The grain in the silo is hers. There is a heady, intoxicating scent to this freedom, mixed with the sharp smell of loss. Historians have long debated the golden age of the medieval widow, arguing that this was the only time a woman could truly exert power. The wife of Bath, Chaucer's famous character, is the archetype of this. A woman who has buried 5 husbands, gained wealth and experience from each, and now roams the world doing exactly as she pleases. But the filthy truth is that this freedom was a fortress under siege. A wealthy widow was a target. In a society where land was power, a woman controlling a third of an estate was a loose variable that needed to be tied down. The pressure to remarry was immediate and relentless. If she was young and fertile, she was a womb to be harvested. If she was older and wealthy, she was a bank vault to be raided. We see the suitors lining up at the funeral feast, barely waiting for the earth to settle. The king or the local lord might even try to force her into a new marriage to reward a loyal knight. "Here, take this widow and her lands," was a common way to pay a debt. This brings us to one of the most fascinating strategies of resistance, the vow of chastity. The camera focuses on a solemn ceremony in the bishop's chapel. The widow kneels before the altar. She is not becoming a nun. She is not entering a convent to be shut away. She is taking a vow to remain a widow. She receives the mantle and ring, a ceremonial veil and a ring, often her wedding ring, re-blessed. By taking this vow, she places herself under the special protection of the church. It is a brilliant legal maneuver. It makes it a sin to force her to marry. It is a get-out-of-jail-free card against unwanted suitors. She can now live in the world, manage her estates, and wear her black veil as a shield. She has effectively married herself. Let us look at the sensory reality of her new life. The colors have drained away. She wears the widow's weeds, layers of heavy black cloth, a barb, a pleated linen cloth worn under the chin, and a veil. These clothes are a signal. Do not touch. I am in mourning. But they are also a disguise. Under the veil, she can observe the world without being observed. She moves through the streets like a ghost, accorded a newfound respect. Men step aside. The village boys do not jeer. She has graduated from the sexual marketplace and entered the realm of the matriarch. However, for the poor widow, the story is less about power and more about precarious survival. If she has no land, no dowry, and no grown sons to help her, the key she holds opens nothing but an empty cupboard. The filthy truth of poverty bites hardest here. We see the spinster, originally just a woman who spins wool, becoming a term of pity. She might have to rely on the charity of the parish, or move into the corner of a son's house, demoted from mistress of the home to a tolerated guest. The hearth tax records of the era show us thousands of these women living on the margins, scraping a living by brewing small batches of ale, selling eggs, or washing clothes. The freedom of the femme soul is cold comfort when the fire is out. Yet, many chose it. The demographics tell a story of resilience. We see a high number of widows in medieval towns who never remarried. They formed networks, households of women living together, sharing the rent, pooling their resources. They became the alewives, the silkwomen, the landladies. They discovered that life without a master was hard, but it was theirs. They could go to bed when they wanted. They could eat what they wanted. They could leave the house without asking permission. After decades of obedience to father, then to husband, the silence of the empty house might have sounded not like loneliness, but like peace. There is a moment of dark humor to be found in the wills they wrote. Free from the influence of a husband, the widow's true feelings often spilled out in ink. We see bequests that settle old scores, leaving a favorite dress to a niece while snubbing a pushy daughter-in-law, or leaving money to a church for prayers only if the priest stopped singing so off-key. They curated their own legacies. They commissioned their own tombs. often choosing to be buried with their first husband, the one they loved, rather than the second or third, the ones they endured, or sometimes choosing to be buried alone, a final statement of independence. As the camera pulls back from the widow standing in her hall, we see her turn the key in the lock of the great chest. The click is loud and decisive. She is the keeper of the memory. She is the historian of the family. She holds the stories of the man who is gone, polishing the rough edges of his memory until he becomes a saint in the retelling, or perhaps letting the truth sit in the silence. She is the survivor. The medieval marriage system was designed to crush her into a shape that fit the needs of men. But here, at the end, she has regained her form. The sun is setting on her life, casting long shadows across the floorboards. She is an old woman now, by medieval standards, perhaps 50 or 60. Her hands are gnarled, her vision blurring. But she stands straight. She is no longer Thomas's wife or John's daughter. She is herself. The veil covers her hair, but her eyes are open. She walks to the window and looks out at the fields she now owns, at the village where she has washed, birthed, and mourned. The journey of marriage has ended, not in a fairy tale sunset, but in the quiet, sturdy dignity of a woman holding her own keys. The darkness is coming, but she is not afraid of the dark anymore. She has lived through the filth and the beauty, and she is still standing. The candle has burned down to a pool of wax. The chest is locked. The key has fallen from the hand, and the breath that fogged the winter air has stilled. The camera of our narrative now moves to the final destination of this long, arduous journey. We step outside the cottage, outside the manor, and walk through the lich gate, the corpse gate, into the green, undulating silence of the churchyard. This section is called Resting in the Quiet Earth, and it brings our story to its natural, inevitable conclusion. We have followed the medieval couple from the cradle to the altar, through the mud of the fields and the blood of the birthing chamber. Now we watch them return to the soil that sustained them. The filthy truth of medieval marriage is that it was a contract, until death do us part. But the relationship between the living and the dead continued long after the heart stopped beating. First, we must witness the preparation. Just as the bride was washed before her wedding, the body is washed for the grave. It is a poignant callback, a closing of the circle. The same women who bathed the infants and the brides, the gossips and the midwives, now perform this final service. They wash the skin with warm water and herbs, scrubbing away the grime of the final illness. They are not afraid. Death was a neighbor in the Middle Ages, a frequent visitor who sat at the dinner table. They handle the body with a familiarity that we have lost, straightening the limbs before rigor mortis sets in. There is no silk dress or mustard tunic for this occasion. The dead are wrapped in a shroud, a simple sheet of white linen or wool, knotted at the head and feet. For the poor, there is no coffin. Wood is expensive and better used for fences or fires. The body is placed directly into the earth. This brings us to a stark sensory reality, the intimacy with the soil. They are returned to the very mud they plowed. The phrase, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, is not a metaphor here. It is an instruction manual. The churchyard itself is not the manicured, silent garden of a modern cemetery. It is the center of village life. The filthy truth is that the medieval dead lived in the middle of the noise. We see sheep grazing between the grave mounds, keeping the grass short. We see children playing tag, around the yew trees. On market days, stalls might be set up right against the church walls. The dead were not exiled to the outskirts of town. They remained part of the community, sleeping just below the surface of the daily hustle. It was a crowded dormitory. Because space was limited and consecrated ground was scarce, a grave was not a permanent address. It was a lease. After a few years or decades, when the flesh had returned to dust and the space was needed for a new tenant, the bones were dug up. This sounds gruesome to us, but to them, it was practical. The bones were reverently collected and placed in a charnel house or ossuary, a stone building or crypt near the church. Here, the thigh bones were stacked like firewood, and the skulls were arranged in rows. It was the ultimate dissolution of the individual. In the charnel house, the lord and the peasant, the beauty and the scold, were finally, truly equal. You could not tell which skull had worn a crown and which had worn a hood. But for those who could afford it, the marriage continued in stone. We enter the cool, quiet interior of the church to look at the tombs of the nobility. Here, we see the effigies, life-size stone statues of the husband and wife lying side by side on top of a sarcophagus. They are frozen in eternal rest. He is often in his armor, a lion at his feet to symbolize courage. She is in her finest gown, a small dog at her feet to symbolize fidelity. But look closely at their hands. They are often clasped together. Even in stone, the yoke remains. They are holding hands across the centuries, a public declaration that their alliance survived the grave. There is a touching, albeit slightly humorous, evolution in these statues. In the early medieval period, the figures are stiff and staring. By the 14th century, they soften. We see husbands turning slightly toward their wives, or wives with their eyes open, looking at their husbands. It is a stone romance, a permanent date night in the nave. But beneath the stone, the reality was just as messy as life. Some wills explicitly stated not to be buried next to a specific spouse. Bury me with my first wife, Alice, for she was good-natured, and not with Joan, who scolded. Even in death, one seeks a little peace and quiet. The scholarly debate here touches on the concept of purgatory. The medievals believed that after death, the soul went to a place of purging fire to burn off the accumulated sins of a lifetime before entering heaven. This created a massive industry of prayer. The surviving spouse was obligated to pray for the soul of the departed to shorten their time in the flames. A wealthy husband would leave money to pay priests to sing masses for his soul forever, a chantry. But for the poor widow, the currency was her own breath. She would whisper prayers for her husband while she spun wool, a constant murmuring connection to the invisible world. The marriage contract had an afterlife clause. I worked for you in life. You pray for me in death. As the centuries pass, the wooden crosses of the peasant graves rot and disappear. The mounds sink back into the flat earth. The names Thomas, Alice, John, Margaret are forgotten. The filthy truth is that we do not know who they were. They left no diaries, no portraits, no monuments. They are the silent majority of history. But as we stand in the twilight of the churchyard, the wind rustling the leaves of the ancient yew tree, which has likely stood here since they were alive, we realize a profound truth. They are not gone. Look at your own hands, the shape of your fingernails, the color of your eyes, the way your hair curls in the humidity. These are the heirlooms they left you. You are the monument. Their struggle to survive the famine, their resilience in the face of the plague, their ability to find warmth in a cold bed, all of that genetic tenacity has been passed down, link by link, through the chain of history to sit in the chair where you are right now. They did not build stone castles that lasted. They built you. The camera pulls up, higher and higher, leaving the churchyard behind. The village shrinks to a patchwork of fields and roofs. The smoke from the chimneys blends into the grey clouds. The sounds of the medieval world, the blacksmith's hammer, the church bell, the ox cart's creak, fade into the distance. The filthy truth of their lives washes away, leaving only the human essence. They were people who were cold and wanted to be warm. They were hungry and wanted to be fed. They were lonely and wanted to be held. They were us, just wearing different clothes and living under a harsher sky. We leave them now, resting in the quiet earth. The struggle is over. The dowries are paid. The debts are settled. The harvest is in. They sleep side by side, the plowman and the princess, under the same blanket of stars that watches over us tonight. The history book closes, not with a slam, but with a gentle sigh. The dust motes dance in the last shaft of light, and then the darkness takes them, soft and forgiving. The journey is complete. The heavy wooden door of the past has been pulled shut, latching with a soft, final click. The noise of the wedding feast, the whispers of the court, and the roar of the wind over the fields have all faded into a gentle silence. You are back in your own time, in your own safe, warm space. There is no more work to be done, no fields to plow, no contracts to sign, no expectations to meet. The yoke has been lifted from your shoulders. You are free to simply be. Let the weight of the history we have traveled through sink into the ground, leaving you light and unburdened. The centuries have turned, but the night is still the same, a quiet velvet wrap that invites you to rest. Breathe in the calm of the present moment. The air is still. The shadows are friendly. You are part of the long, unbroken chain of life. And tonight, your only duty is to sleep. Let your eyes close. Let your breathing slow to the rhythm of the earth itself. The story is over. The peace remains. Sweet dreams.